Throughout its millennia of recorded history, Italy's fragmented landscape has served as both a cultural melting pot and a battleground. Many centuries before the rise of Rome, the peninsula was a crossroads for travelers and a canvas for diverse societies to emerge. Among these many pre-Roman ethnic groups, the Samnites became renowned for their bravery and relentless fight for freedom against the Romans. Nestled in the rugged mountains of south-central Italy, the Samnites forged a unique identity that blended indigenous traditions with influences from neighboring cultures. The Samnites were much more than just warriors. They were a society that learned to adapt to difficult environments and climates, showing us a tale of resilience that is often overlooked by their ultimate defeat in one of the bloodiest conflicts fought by the Roman Republic, the Samnite Wars. Welcome to our video on the fascinating world of the Samnites, one of the most fearless Italic peoples of pre-Roman Italy.
You probably think you have that fearless resilience, but you don't until you upgrade your vulnerable gear with our sponsors today, dbrand. Got electronics? Then you've got something that'll break if an ant sneezes in your general direction, and it won't be cheap to fix. Everyday risks like dropping your phone on the kitchen counter or scratching the screen of your Steam Deck with your watch can be avoided with dbrand's easy-to-apply cases and screen protectors. Our producer grabbed a screen protector and case for his phone. The protector is easy to apply with their step-by-step guide to get a smooth, bubble-free layer of armor on top of your screen, and the case is even easier. You can do something similar with a Switch or Steam Deck too. Highly recommended if you actually play them outside and stuff like their adverts insist is the cool thing to do. But to look even cooler, you'll want to grab some of dbrand's many custom skins, available for all kinds of devices. Wish your PS5 had that 90s colourful translucent vibe? Yes, you do, and dbrand can sort that out for you. There are loads of options for loads of devices in your life, so go see what dbrand can upgrade for you at dbrand.com, link in the description.
Before we launch into our history of the Samnite people, let us first briefly map out the world of Iron Age Italy that emerged from the 9th to the 6th centuries BCE. Hundreds of years before Rome came to dominate the peninsula, the central and southern regions of Italy were home to a series of pre-Roman Italic populations, like the Latins, the Umbrians, the Sabines, and of course, the Samnites. On the Tyrrhenian coast, the Etruscans dominated with their sophisticated urban culture, standing out for their non-Indo-European language and lavish lifestyle. Along the southern coasts of Italy, Greek settlers established powerful colonies, collectively known as Magna Graecia. The Phoenicians also operated in southern Italy, particularly on the islands of Sicily and Sardinia, establishing cities and ports of trade. In northern Italy, the rich cultures of Goliseca, the Liguri, and the Veneti played a key role in connecting Mediterranean and continental Europe. Long before Rome became a significant player, the Italic peoples were included in wider networks of contact that connected the entire Mediterranean, shaped by interaction, rivalry, and exchange. The historical homeland of the Samnite people corresponds to today's Molise, Abruzzo, and parts of Campania, Lazio, Puglia, and Basilicata. This region was known as Samnium, the Latin term used to indicate the region occupied by the Samnites. It is a rough, mountainous region, characterized by the imposing Apennine peaks broken down by fertile river valleys like the Biferno and Volturno. The origins of the Samnites can be traced archaeologically. Evidence of the initial occupation of Samnite centers can be dated between the Bronze and the Iron Age. These prehistoric settlements would eventually become structured into a hierarchical order of minor centers, headed by larger ones. However, these centers cannot be compared to the large cities of Tyrrhenian Italy. Historical sources on the origins of the Samnites come to us via mythology and ancient sources, whose records of Samnite history begin in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. According to historical sources like the ancient Greek geographer Strabo, who lived between the 1st century BCE and the 1st century AD, this was a period when bands of young warrior shepherds roamed the hills of central Italy in search of a new place to relocate in order to appease Memes, the Samnite equivalent to Mars, the Roman god of war. According to Strabo, The Samnites were a result of migrations originating from another pre-Roman Italic people known as the Sabines, an ethnic group inhabiting the central Apennines. The group of Sabines who would eventually become the Samnites were allegedly guided by a bull, which eventually gave the name to one of their most important settlements, Bavaria. Their economy was largely based on agriculture, which was concentrated on the coastal plains of Abruzzo and Molise. In the more mountainous Apennine hinterland, pastoralism and the timber trade were the main ways of life. Transhumance was also practiced, with shepherds' paths and tracks being particularly important in influencing the settlement patterns in these mountainous areas. Despite this lifestyle, we should not fall into the error of thinking that the Samnites were isolated barbarians. They conducted extensive trade with other regions, such as through the Adriatic plains, various river valleys like the Trigno and Sangro, as well as mountain passes. Ancient authors report that the Samnites were divided into several tribes, tied into a confederation, as they shared a common Oscan language and similar religious practices. The tribes included the Pentri, Caudini, Hirpini, Caricini, and, perhaps, the Frentani. Strabo lists the latter as part of the Samnites, but their role seems to be more independent from the Confederacy, as their position on the coast gave them more freedom to act independently. The League of the Samnites met at federal councils, usually held at major sanctuaries, and was a testament to the ability of non-urbanized peoples to mobilize during wartime and come together to pursue a common goal. Throughout the first part of the first millennium BCE, the dominant form of burial was inhumation, with bodies being buried and then covered by stones. From the 6th century BCE, however, more elaborate inhumation graves emerge in the uplands, with exceptional individual graves, such as the famous Capistrano warrior, marked by more impressive pieces of art. Local elites' graves were also signalled by precious goods. Grave goods in the so-called warrior burials usually contained spears or javelins, as well as daggers, axes, and mace heads. These elements are usually found in male burials. Many female tombs, the so-called princesses, were filled with local or exotic personal ornaments, like fibulae, beads, and pendants, which were symbols of their wealth and social standing. Some female graves also had more elaborate jewelry, such as the Bisaccia princess, and may suggest that Samnite women could amass wealth on their own initiative. Traditionally, researchers have interpreted Samnite burials through a rigid binary that saw men as warriors, buried with weapons, and women as princesses, adorned with jewelry and personal ornaments. However, more recent archaeology has revealed that gender was a more fluid and malleable concept in Samnite communities than previously assumed. Some men were, in fact, buried with ornaments normally associated with the princesses, while some women received warrior treatment. Local elites' graves were also signalled by the materials buried with the deceased. These objects signal the existence of powerful aristocrats who were able to exploit labour and resources, and who represented their status with the accumulation and display of wealth. Like other Italic populations, such as the ancient Etruscans, great importance was given to drinking and banqueting as defining factors or activities of these rich aristocrats. The personal kit of the buried consisted of a large container, or olla, craters, amphorae, dippers, jugs, cups, and other drinking implements. Materials related to these activities are present both in male and female tombs, despite the fact that this habit emerged from the ancient Greek tradition of the symposium, which was strictly a male activity. The Samnites therefore re-elaborated the Greek symposium and adapted it to their own social structure, notably by opening this activity to women. These burials are particularly important because they provide most of what we know about the Samnite religion before the 5th century BCE. Based on them, historians have been able to tentatively suggest that Samnite cults were tied to the natural world and to natural spaces in this period. More clear information on Samnite spirituality begins to appear from the 5th century BCE onwards, when people started to leave religious offerings at sacred sites. The Samnites worshipped various deities, many of which were related to the typical Mediterranean religious repertoire. The religious art found in Samnium shows evidence of contact with Etruscan and Greek iconographies. The pantheon worshipped pan-Italian divine figures, who can also be assimilated to figures in Greek religion. One of the most famous extant archaeological pieces related to Samnite religious cults is the Agnoni bronze tablets, found in Molise. Engraved in the Oscan language, these tablets outline the ritual calendar of a sacred grove of the goddess Ceres, the Samnite manifestation of the Roman Ceres, goddess of grain crops, agriculture, and fertility. The god who appears the most in Samnite religious remains is none other than Heracles, depicted in various aspects but mostly with a club and adorned with a lion's skin. Early scholarship has linked this widespread cult to the pastoralist nature of Samnium's economy, due to Heracles' mythological role as protector of herds and herdsmen. Many other Italic populations worshipped Heracles, but his cult was particularly popular in Samnium. Another popular deity was Mefitis, widely worshipped in central and southern Italy, and related to sulphurous springs and therefore the underworld. Parallel to religion, other things began to change in Samnite society during the 5th century BCE. The cemeteries, for example, began to incorporate cremations as well as inhumations, a shift that suggests an increase in contacts and cultural exchanges with their Greek neighbours, for whom cremation was the preferred burial rite. These burials also showcase how the Samnites had acquired access to goods across a wider swath of the Mediterranean, as they include imports and exotic artifacts, such as gilt terracotta wreaths, bronze and iron strigils, and fine-ware pottery. Still, no homogeneous Samnite identity existed at this time, as different communities preferred different funerary and cult practices, depending on the different cultures they were in contact with. From the 5th century BCE onwards, Samnite society centralized around polities with aristocratic elites. These polities were called teuta, with each headed by a magistrate titled the medis teuctix. This shift from many smaller settlements to fewer larger ones is represented by the fact that sanctuaries began to flourish as the new social, political, administrative, and religious centers. These sanctuaries also functioned as military strongholds, marketplaces, or border markers in marginal areas. Despite the development of state-like structures, Samnium never underwent an urbanization process like that of central Italy. However, one particular phenomenon sets Samnium apart from the rest of central Italy. That is the rapid growth in the number of hillforts, particularly from the 5th century BCE. These elevated structures were built on strategically elevated locations, such as Monte Vairano or Monte Palano. The Samnite hillforts were similarly varied in their function, being primarily military, but also sending signals of power and status to neighbors and potential enemies. Studies have revealed that these structures were defined by intervisibility, allowing long-distance communication, perhaps through the use of fire signals. The growth in the number of hillforts has been linked to the rising hostilities with Rome and its interest in the region. In fact, Rome's pressure probably even caused the restoration of some previously abandoned hillforts. As we move into the 4th century BCE, we can finally explain why the Samnites acquired the honorary status of being one of the most vicious opponents in Roman history. The Samnite Wars consisted of a series of 3 conflicts, spanning from the mid-4th century to the early 3rd century BCE. These conflicts saw the Samnites fighting against Rome, with both sides involving their allies in the battles therein. The most consistent amount of historiographical information on these conflicts comes from Roman historian Livy, who lived around 3 centuries after the events. We must therefore keep in mind that his accounts reflect ideological and political agendas of the late Republican and early Imperial era, and are considered biased against the Samnite enemies of Rome. The casus belli of the First Samnite Wars, which began in 343 and ended in 341 BCE, is commonly identified as the intervention of the Romans against the Samnites in response to Capua's call for aid. This chain of events began when the Samnites attacked their neighbours, a people called the Sidicini. Upon facing the Samnite onslaught, the Sidicini asked the inhabitants of powerful Capua for help. However, Capua suffered a heavy defeat against the Samnites and therefore turned to Rome, surrendering to the Republic and beseeching it for protection. Rome agreed to help, albeit with an ulterior motive. Roman control over Capua would have facilitated access to the extremely fertile plains of Campania, allowing them to project power over the entirety of southern Italy. The war ended with a precarious and fragile peace. However, Rome's continued political encroachment into the region of Naples ultimately resulted in another outbreak of conflict between the two expansionist Italic peoples. The result of this was the start of a new conflict in 326 BCE, triggering the 3-decade-long Second Samnite War. Much longer than the first one, and fought across multiple territories such as Campania, Latium, Apulia, and Samnium, the Second Samnite War was a more complex conflict, as many major cities, like Alife, were constantly won and lost by the Romans and Samnites. In addition to the Samnites and the Romans, other populations became involved in this war, mostly from the central Apennines, Apulia, and Campania. For example, in 325 BCE, the city of Tarentum in Puglia was able to spark a broad anti-Roman alliance among neighbouring mountain communities, such as the Lucanians and the Vestini, to which the Romans responded with brutal force, launching a military campaign to crush the uprising before other Apennine populations could join. 2 battles were fought, the first of which allegedly resulted in the deaths of 20,000 Samnites. In contrast, the second one ended in a deadlock because of internal conflicts within the Roman army, which was not happy with its leading commander, Papirius Cursor. These battles ended in a temporary truce, which was broken by a military offensive led by the Samnites in 324 BCE, alongside many local Apulian allies. The most significant battle from this period was the so-called Caudine Forks, one of the most tragic and embarrassing military disasters in early Roman history. Led by one Gaius Pontius, the Samnites were able to trap 2 legions in a mountain gorge near Caudium. Gaius Pontius was able to trick the Romans by sending decoy scouts, which led them to believe that the Apulian city of Lucaria needed their intervention. The only route connecting Campania and Apulia was through the gorge known as the Caudine Forks. Upon entering the area, the Roman legions were surrounded. The Roman consuls, Spurius Postumius and Veturius Calvinus, were forced to surrender. The Samnites demanded that the Romans remove all their colonies from Samnite territories. Livy states that Pontius successfully obtained a Roman surrender and humiliated his adversary by demanding to pass half naked under a yoke. However, a key lesson was learned after this defeat. Romans had to rethink their military tactics and strategies, particularly regarding adapting them to Samnium's rough and mountainous terrain, and, in fact, a new way of conducting battles, previously based on the hoplite system, which was much more effective on flat lands, came together, the Manipular system. The first, obsolete system, was based on the Greek hoplites, heavily armed soldiers who fought tightly side by side, pushing against the enemy in tight ranks and with great force. The Manipular system was instead based on flexibility and maneuverability. The Roman army was expanded from 2 to 4 legions, each organized into 30 maniples of about 120 to 160 men. These were deployed into 3 lines of 10 maniples, favoring more dynamic movements during battle. Crucially, if the front line engaging with the enemy became exhausted, it could fall back while another advanced, ensuring continuous pressure on their adversaries. While the Romans were licking their wounds by initiating the restructuring of their armies, the Samnites capitalized on the period of pause after the Caudine Forks to secure their position through alliances with others, Apulian, Campanian, and Central Apennine groups like the Vestini, Marsi, and Frentani, who were likely ethnically related to them. One of the most important allies was the city of Satricum, based in the Roman heartland of Latium, which served as a military outpost near Rome. However, this alliance only lasted until 319 BCE, when Satricum secretly informed the Roman consul of the movement of a Samnite garrison leaving the city. The Samnites were ambushed and all sympathizers killed. In the same period, the Romans were able to defeat the Frentani, gaining ground towards the Adriatic and putting pressure on the Samnite alliance. Despite these losses, the Samnites gained other important allies in strategic areas, in particular the Liris Valley, which facilitated communications between Rome and Campania. Conquests and pushbacks continued, with the Romans gradually gaining more and more support in the following years. In 304 BCE, a peace was struck, which involved the Samnites conceding key centres and territories lost during the war. Their hold on the territory was further weakened by the foundation of Roman colonies, in particular in the central Apennines around the Fucine Lake at Alba Fucens and Carsioli. The last Samnite attempt to contain the expansion of Roman power in their territories materialized in 298 BCE, with the start of the last Great Samnite War. In this conflict, the Samnites organized a broad and multi-ethnic coalition against Rome, made up of themselves, the Gauls, the Umbrians, and a number of Etruscan cities. This alliance confronted the Roman legions in 295 BCE in one of the greatest battles fought in the Republican period, the Battle of Sentinum. This clash of armies was one of the bloodiest recounted by Livy. Allegedly, 25,000 soldiers of the Samnitic coalition were killed. As a consequence, the Samnites and their allies were left broken, and the battle marked the beginning of the end. In the following years, Roman excursions into Samnium became frequent, with various major centres being captured. By the end of the Third Samnite War, this great and fierce population did not have the strength or resources to resist Rome anymore. After the bloody Samnite Wars, the Samnites essentially became Roman allies. Their elites gained significant advantages from their association with the Republic, and only a few Samnites defected during the Second Punic War between Rome and Carthage, and the social wars of 91 to 88 BCE. Traditional views of Romanization suggest that the Romans simply imposed their culture on conquered people, who passively accepted it. The picture is much more complex. Cultural change among the Samnites did not happen all of a sudden. Instead, it was gradual and defined by cooperation as much as conquest. Rome was able to pull Samnite elites to its aid by offering new opportunities, especially through commercial and military activities in the eastern Mediterranean. Samnite aristocracies were able to acquire more and more Hellenistic and Roman-style costumes to show off status and power, and to compete with one another to gain more advantages. We can see how cultural change was not merely imposed, but it was the result of local ambitions and choices. During the civil war between Sulla and Marius, the Samnites supported Marius, which ultimately proved disastrous for them after his defeat. As a consequence of their betrayal, the Samnites were severely punished, and many of their centres were destroyed. The 1st century BCE was a turning point in the restructuring of Samnite identity under Roman rule. Like most non-Latin tongues throughout Italy, their Oscan language slowly faded into extinction during this time. This went together with the adoption of Roman architecture and urban planning. The Samnites became Roman, and core Samnite cultural markers gradually disappeared in favour of Roman norms. The story of the Samnites goes much deeper than the historical accounts of their barbarism and brutality. It is ultimately a story of resilience and adaptation to harsh environments and historical circumstances. With their malleable identity and ways of life, the Samnites were able to adapt to rugged, mountainous landscapes, creating a rich and complex identity. The Samnites proved that non-urban and decentralized societies can wield significant political and military power in particularly adverse and dire situations. For centuries onwards, the Romans remembered the terrible humiliation at the Caudine Forks, defining the Samnites as one of the most dangerous, fierce, and somewhat indomitable peoples they had ever faced. But as we have seen, the Samnites were much more than that, and deserve to go down in history as more than just a stepping stone in Rome's path to world domination. More videos on the lesser-known peoples of ancient history are on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see them. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing. It helps immensely. Our patrons and YouTube members can watch more than 200 exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description or by pressing the join button under the video. To watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.